Hello, and welcome to our discussion, our critical discussion of Mafia 3. My name is Samantha Blackmon, and I'm an associate professor at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. And I'm joined today by my Black Games Archive co-founder, TreaAndrea Russworm, full professor and endowed chair at USC. Hey, Trey, how are you today?
I'm great, Sam. I'm excited to talk about Mafia 3.
Me too. So we've chose a very specific segment of the game. And the segment that we've chosen because we think that it historically, ideologically, and politically kind of nails some of the reasons that we chose to make Mafia 3 one of our initial games in focus for the Black Games Archive. Specifically, the clip that we are starting with today is a couple of hours into the game. For some of us, it's a couple hours into the game and begins after the flashbacks that help contextualize the journey that we are going to go on as Lincoln Clay. So, Trey, do you want to tell us a little bit about this game and like what the game was when it came out, what the
Mm-hmm.
reception was like?
Yeah, so, I remember Mafia 3 coming out and it was really anticipated among my friend and player circles. We're talking 2016. This game comes out, hotly anticipated by a number of folks that I know, Black players and fans of the series too, honestly, I think, the Mafia franchise, because this is obviously the third installment. There might have been an unnumbered one, but, at least there are two others before you get to Mafia 3. And in 2016, I think it was very hotly anticipated. What do we know about the sales? The game tended to sell actually pretty well in the early run of the game, of the game's release, 2016. It had sold. It was being pegged as one of the fastest selling titles. There's always the fastest selling title, and I think that benchmark is constantly shifting, right? But at least in that moment, it was meeting or exceeding its sales expectations, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 million in the first year, copies sold. So I think that is a very good start. Now, maybe it didn't shatter records, or, maybe it didn't sort of tap out in terms of its max potential. And then, financially, the bar is always high commercially for games that have Black protagonists or themes that, might be associated with Black identity and the pathos of struggle, that these games tend to have really high expectations. But one of the conversations in the medium is typically, we can't take a risk, right? We don't want to take a risk. We don't want to make a game that stars Black characters, especially in a lead role, and run the risk that it won't sell. But I think what Mafia 3 demonstrates is that you can in fact have that game. We've seen other games that have you playing as a Black protagonist that have this action formula at the heart of it, like GTA San Andreas, for example, that do well commercially, financially. But what differentiates Mafia 3 from the Grand Theft Auto franchise is its politics. Is right at the surface of what it's trying to do. And so as far as reception is concerned, player reception, versus critical reception, the player reception has always been mixed or negative, I would say. When you look at the Steam reviews of this game now, that's what you're going to find: mixed player reception, where fans or players of the game critique it for a lot of reasons. I think ideologically, this game is critiqued. This game is disliked, and so the response. So some of the common critiques are the mechanics are clumsy, the gameplay is very repetitive. Kill this boss, clear this warehouse, drive here. That as an open world kind of sandbox style game, you really have a limited set of options, and so it's critiqued by the players, among the players, for not allowing this robust dimension of exploration that we might expect in an open world game. Now, you could say this is true for all of the Mafia 3 games. It is true for all of the Mafia 3 games. For games like The Godfather, you really only have a couple of things that you can do. Clear the warehouse, kill the boss. These are repetitive actions. But the critique, the level of critique about the game, I think, was even higher, more intense, more vocal, because of its politics, because of its political kind of representations, and who you're playing as, and what you're doing in this context of this game that takes place in 1968. And you are a black war vet, a black Vietnam vet who's come home and is getting mixed into this organized crime scene in a fictional Louisiana, New Bordeaux. So that's a little bit of the backdrop of the game. We're just going to dive into some of the key moments and key themes and how this game registers with our taxonomy that we're using for the archive, which will help explain why it's here. And if you want to do further reading, further gameplay, further research on this title, we're going to give you some of the nodes that we critically keep coming back to. But I can say unilaterally that the people I know, and when I played it in 2016, loved the experience of playing this game. It's not without its flaws, but it is such a unique title for any number of reasons.
One of the things that I always find interesting when like going back, because I covered this game a lot in class, right? In different classes, especially in my like games and diversity class. I always find it really interesting that I can ask students, have you played this game? And while they may have played the earlier Mafia games, this one like almost always gets a no. That students haven't played this one, and I don't know why. Is it because we have a black protagonist? Is it because the game didn't get the same kind of reception that some of the earlier games got? Or for what reason, right? Do people just not think of like black folks in New Orleans when they think of the Mafia? I mean, and so they're like, that's not a Mafia game. So it's pretty interesting. And that's why when we went back and looked at like sales and reception, I because I couldn't remember, it's been 7 years at this point. I couldn't remember what the sales were like from 7 years ago. So I was kind of shocked that the sales were as high as they were.
They were strong, but the word on the street was always like, oh, this is a failure. It didn't do well. Commercially, it did fine. It did more than fine. And, but I think that some of the critiques among the players really set it back in terms of its replayability or being embraced. And again, it's politics. It's that not everybody wants to see a black lead character with this kind of agency in this social context, right? In a racially hostile environment. And you have this element of power. You can go and take out, and there is a racially charged context to the scene, to the narrative, where you're being called the N-word this, N-word that. You definitely see the politics and the geospatial like politics, and you see how segregated aspects of the city are. And you also are dealing with crime bosses that are racist, that are outwardly racist, different sectors of the community that are outwardly racist. And it's not a game that just wholesale endorses that racism, where you are subordinated as the player, as the black player and the black character, right? It's not a game that arguably kind of glorifies that frame so that it creates its realism through the glorification of that, and then you are just subject to that. You're just subjugated, right? It's not doing that. It may be spectacularizing and glorifying those dynamics to an extent. I would argue that it is, but you also have this exacting amount of power that is demonstrated through what Lincoln Clay is trying to do in this scene. Are there limits to that power? We can definitely get into the weeds of that. But to play a black lead character with this kind of agency, go kill all these mob bosses, all of these Klansmen, all of these hillbillies that are racist and have like black slave trades, sex trades.
Mhm.
You're working against all of that, and not everybody wants to see, receive, or experience that
Yeah.
that that message.
And it's interesting because they begin the game with a disclaimer, right? That there's going to be there's going to be offensive language, and that they're maintaining that for not only for the sake of the narrative, but also to kind of set a political, historical, a kind of racial tone of like what's going on in the 1960s in the American South, but specifically in a fictionalized American South in New Bordeaux.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get started. So this segment of the video, I think, is the part that we're starting with, because here's the part where they have kind of successfully completed the job that they had with Sal Marcano, who is the local mob boss. And it's an interesting part because you and I were talking about this last night. Well, you texted me because this is kind of the portion of the game that gets to be really interesting, because Sal had already asked Lincoln at this point to start running the local mob in the Negro area, right, to take it over from his stepfather, and he had declined. But they have a good bit of money, millions of dollars at this point, and they're supposed to be divvying it up.
They robbed the Federal Reserve.
Which yeah,
you do.
Yeah. As you do, you rob the Federal Reserve. And so I think one of the interesting things is the way that Lincoln Clay gets described, right? Why folks want him, right? Sal Marcano wants him because he is special forces, because he is really the magic Negro, right? The ways that he gets described kind of throughout the game, and this scene is another kind of way that he gets another area that he gets depicted, if not necessarily described as kind of the magic Negro. But I won't spoil it until we get there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, he's definitely described as a magic Negro, and we could talk about that, because I don't know if you're not going to hear the narration for that.
Mhm.
But one of the things I want to mention is the structure of this game and how you experience it, right? So I would say this we talked about this with Dot's Home and what's going on temporally in terms of blackness and representation and time. So you definitely have kind of non-linear segments kind of spliced throughout, so that the narrative is being told from like in a documentary style frame, where a bunch of people are being interviewed and talking about basically the life and times of Lincoln Clay.
Yes.
When you start the game, it's this legendary radical violent black Negro. Black Negro, he's real black. I said black Negro.
He's a
Double
black
down,
Negro.
he's a black Negro. you know you're you are playing, you're hearing the story being set up through these interviews, and
Mhm.
Father James is one of the people who's helping piece this together of what happened, right? Through the series of interviews and congressional hearings and like the CIA investigation. So when you are actually playing as Lincoln, you can be playing from any of these different moments in his life, in this time frame, in this span of time, and it's
Mhm.
not necessarily linear. But in the narration, in these interviews, one of the first ways that Lincoln is introduced to you, to us as the players, is by Father James saying, basically his racial lineage and heritage is, he thinks his mother was Dominican, and I think Lincoln was orphaned, at a young age, but his mother was Dominican, and they believe his father was Italian, so he's biracial. And those two descriptors, Italian and Dominican, in this context, may or may not necessarily be read as black, but Father James insists in those days, if you look black, you were black, right? Like that's exactly what he says, that if you look black, you're black. And so Lincoln is positioned in this segregated part of New Orleans as a black man, despite the fact that he's actually biracial, Dominican and Italian. He's not read in that way. And we know that the color and racial dynamics of New Orleans is also itself very complicated with different aspects of culture and ancestry and skin tone commingling and mixing in this climate. So he would have been a light-skinned, and he is visually, he's coded as that, a lighter skin but read as black person.
So it's interesting because, like you say, New Orleans has a very interesting history of miscegenation, and it's almost like he comes to his place as Mafia 3 in the same way that biracial protagonists come to their space in Assassin's Creed, right? That they have to have some kind of white lineage, and in this case, Italian lineage, specifically because of the Mafia. But what we just saw was some interesting things, and I want to point these things out when we talk about, one, the myth of the Magic Negro. He gets shot point blank in the head and survives. One. Two, we just saw as Lincoln is being nursed back to health by Father James, is like on the TV, we start to see what's going on in the world during this time, right, with the assassination of JFK, civil rights movements, and kind of civil unrest, right? The kinds of things that contextualize what's going on in the world around him, that situates this more kind of historically and more realistically in a very specific point in time, right? And using footage that appears to be kind of like actual newsreel footage in order to do this, rather than like to see it in the paper or hear people talking about it, which I think is a very interesting thing, because again, it's situating it in the civil rights movement, right? And again, situating it in an area in a field of blackness. Which I think is really important. But to go back to the surviving being shot point blank in the head, I mean, that's
everybody's killed in Sammy's bar. So you're there with your stepfather, your friends, your brother, your half brother or adopted brother, whatever, and you're all celebrating. And Saul, the bigger crime boss, comes and they just take everybody out, and you included. You're shot in the head, point blank in the head. You survived this, and with the help of your CIA buddy, because it also becomes a buddy film, a biracial buddy film, what's his name, Donovan, and you're recuperating, and now you're on a revenge quest. Your motivation in the story as Lincoln is to kill everybody. Your motivation is to get revenge, for Sammy and for your family that's slaughtered in these opening scenes.
And he says that Father James says, look, if you got to kill Sal Marcano, you kill Sal Marcano. I agree, he's got to die, but you leave it there. And he's like, no. Right? It's like, that's not good enough. He's got to lose everything he has first, just like he did to me, right? So it is more than just, I'm going to kill him because of what he did, but it's that I'm going to take it all the way there.
Look at you driving in this.
Hey,
look, the driving is hard in this game. These cars are clunky, and again, players really harped on these things, that the mechanics are kind of clunky and clumsy at times. The driving is not fun. I love driving games, but the driving in this game is not fun.
The driving in this game,
but you can see fun. Sam is driving below the speed limit right now.
I am driving below the speed.
You gingerly turned that corner.
I did, but I was intentionally driving. In my defense, intentionally driving below the speed limit at this part because I wanted to make sure we had this whole Donovan conversation. There's some other times that, I would drive slowly, but that's because I don't, want to crash into things or run into people. But
yeah. So so Lincoln is to talk about him as a magical Negro. He's superhuman. He's presented as like, I have this superhuman strength. Now, what video game characters are not superhuman? Primary characters in a either action adventure mode, action game, third person game, the GTA series even. I don't think you necessarily come across as superhuman. You come across as like super criminal and and you got all your weapons and stuff, but his physicality, his physique, which people comment on in the game, I think Sammy says to him,
who's this big Negro that ate my son or something like that?
Exactly, because he's just Herculean, coming in there. So you do get a little bit of that from his physicality and his moves, his animations. And I noted in our notes that it doesn't always quite work well to me, that it does feel very kind of caricatured, black, sort of the black buck kind of caricature does get mapped onto Lincoln, I think. And you have to combine that with his multitude of layers of like post-traumatic stress. He is a Vietnam vet who is already, psychologically, physiologically dealing with that because he's just gotten home from serving. And then he's a part of this slaughter scene, where his family is killed and he's, shot. And so he's having flashbacks. He is blinded by this hatred and this rage. And that's what motivates all of this. And it comes across in his animations and his physiques. And he's just merciless. I mean, he is you have a couple of early missions and I'm like, I feel more than I did in 2016 when I played this. I felt his trauma, like as I am, especially the kill the Haitians mission, which we have to talk about very early on. I think it's before this. You have to go and just murder all these Haitians because internally there's also intra-racial conflicts among the Black groups in the city. And so, Lincoln's family and his crew are always at odds with the Haitians. And so, they're like, fuck the Haitians, go kill it. And so you have to do that. And I don't want to do that as a player, right? I'm like, wait a minute, Lincoln, like these are our allies. These should be our allies. How do we work through that? But there are a lot of like stereotypes that get mapped onto the Haitians. And then as Lincoln in a just vengeful, this is before Sammy even dies, you got to go and slaughter all these folks. But I'm feeling his trauma as a vet, as a war vet, ducking cover, I'm hiding, and you feel like you're back in a war, so I felt that for sure. But he has layers upon layers of post-traumatic stress for that you have to play through, and I think the game is conscious of that.
It's definitely conscious of it, right? Because it's not just that we experience it or we see it, but Ellis actually mentions it the first night that Lincoln comes home, because when Lincoln comes home, they have a party. He's intoxicated, and everybody's going to bed. And Ellis says, "Oh, your room's just the way it was when you left it." And he says, "I'm going to sleep in the basement." And Ellis just kind of laughs at him and goes, "Ha ha ha, that war really fucked you up, didn't it?" Right? I mean, that's literally what he says to him, right? So there is that very specific mention of the kind of trauma that he's gone through. And here, when he's coming back to Sammy's for the first time, after the murders have taken place, he has these flashbacks. These flashbacks that are of that night, but are also kind of reflective of the same kinds of flashbacks that he had about the war itself. Right. So there's that real connection between the war overseas and this war that he's going to start fighting at home.
Right. And he has these like auditory and like visual hallucinations where he's reliving these traumatic moments. And, so you definitely see that. And he's, so you feel that as a player. I'm going to mention, kind of at this point, what aspects of the taxonomy we use to consider this game. And I'm just going to run through them, but I think in some of the scenes that are coming up, we will be able to say a little more specifically about them. But I just want to get it out there because as you'll notice in the archive, most games don't have this many descriptors, don't hit on this many things in the taxonomy. But Mafia 3 is a unique case because it has so many of the 13 things that we have listed, you know, that we're checking. I think Mafia 3, well, we'll count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It has 10 of them. And at least at this point, before we do a final review of it. But the things are development, Black playable characters. Oh, Black playable characters, voice acting, Black cultural traditions, politics, ideology, history, narrative themes, Black NPCs, intersectionality, fandom, community reception, and anti-Blackness. And I think that's all that applies here from the taxonomy. Because some of the things that we would have left out are like the modifications, the player mods, community, and yeah, significant Black cultural mods, character creation system. There's not that. Oh, and mechanics. So it has more than that.
It does have
It has
mechanics.
all but two. It has all but two things on the taxonomy. So that's pretty significant, right? It has it has the most of any game so far in the archive of things that apply to it.
Can we talk about the anti-Blackness, because I think the anti-Blackness is interesting, right? Because I wonder, when I think about it in terms of like the anti-Blackness and the kind of the kill the Haitians, because that also becomes a mechanic. This suspicion of, and the
the voodoo dolls. Are you thinking about
yeah,
that?
with the voodoo dolls, and so a lot of that becomes a mechanic in the game itself, right? Because you can use voodoo dolls to scare like folks in the Dixie Mafia, but Dixie Mafia or in the Mafia period, so you can scare white folks in the game. You can scare white folks in the game by calling upon kind of voodoo traditions, right? Of any sort, and you can use that to like aid you in stealth or aid you in getting away in certain situations.
Wait a minute, look at you with all these clothes. I don't have the clothing options unlocked yet. Okay, look at that. He's bald, the revolutionary outfit. Okay, Sam.
I have played this game so many times, Trey.
Yeah.
But so it's interesting though when we think about it in this way, right? Is I wonder, yes, it is anti-Black if we think about it kind of holistically, but I wonder how much of it is supposed to be reflexive of kind of the social interactions between locals in New Orleans and the Haitians who were just coming over to the US after kind of the whole Papa Doc situation. And so I'm like,
even if it is trying to like realistically demonstrate what those tensions among groups within the Black community are like, even if it's trying to sort of faithfully say that, because we know colorism, skin tone politics, we know that white supremacy, you know, it cycles through and circles through communities of color too, and that you can also you know, perpetuate those things in certain in these contexts. And so where, you know, the lighter skin, you know, Negroes are biased against dark skinned Negroes, etc. Like we have those kinds of fault lines and influences at an intracultural level for sure. But even if it is trying to just kind of represent that, I think that is still anti-Black, right? Even if it's like, yes, we're trying to be sort of faithful to those dynamics, that is still a kind of anti-Black kind of ideology at work and being represented here. It's the question is how much is the game kind of critical of that and pushing back against it, or how much does it sort of really just sit in it and maybe exploit it? Like you can have those voodoo dolls that you're talking about that you can throw. I think there's a good deal style of kind of mocking Haitian traditions that is like critically left unchecked. But
Mhm.
I haven't played the game in a really long time. I'm playing it again now, and I want to kind of be able to read for those finer lines because Cassandra is my girl, and she's coming from the same community.
Mhm.
And Lincoln works with her, but he also works with some jackasses, some racist jackasses too, and the other bosses, right? So it doesn't mean that just because he's working with these people that like ideologically they're aligned, I don't think, or
Mhm.
socially they're not totally aligned. So yeah, it's interesting. It represents that. And then I think when it comes to the anti-blackness, the reason why I flagged it is because again, all these characterizations of Lincoln, that are unsettling, right? Yes, it's an action game. I would argue it has a lot in common with blaxploitation cinema, where you are the man, you're Shaft, you're this. There are these like physical power fantasies that circulate right at the heart of the Black action film cycle. And so
Mhm.
I think it does kind of work in that register too. But it's like he's superhuman in a way that has a certain kind of social, political, racial context. That
Yes.
it doesn't mean that it undoes. It has to sit with that kind of those kinds of tensions and realities, even as it hits on a number of other things that you're like Black cultural traditions, Black playable characters, etc. It has all this stuff, but it's still in that domain of maybe reinforcing some of these tropes and stereotypes.
And I would agree with you wholeheartedly. And you mentioned it earlier in that you talked about how this hits a little differently than it did when you initially played it in 2016. So if we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about like even what's happening in like the real world, right, in 2016, 2017 and beyond, is like we're getting more attention paid to the murder of Black folks by police, right? And one of the interesting things, and I one of the things that I love most about this game is just being able to get in a car and listen to the radio.
Mm-hmm.
So not only listen to the music, but also listen to the talk shows. And they made some very specific choices in terms of like the talk shows, right? There's very specific dialogue in the talk shows or the radio talk shows that talk about the murder of Black folks by police, right? So I think that they are drawing some real connections between what's going on in the real world and what's going on in the game.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but I think at the same time that the myth of the magic Negro, right? And this kind of the fact that the fact that he's indestructible, the fact that he is huge, that he is this terrifying figure, and also that other people like the Haitians are terrifying because of their culture and they are used strategically
Mm-hmm.
in that way. I think really kind of that ties all of this back to the ways that folks talk about Black folks in general in the real world in 2016, 2017, and even before, right? And use that as an excuse to murder them. Right. I
Mm-hmm.
was, he had superhuman strength. He didn't look human. Right. We've heard these excuses before
Mm-hmm.
when police officers have justified murdering unarmed Black men. He was huge. He didn't look human. He looked like some kind of supernatural creature, right? And
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
exactly what we're getting in Lincoln Clay. And I always talk about Lincoln in terms of being an anti-hero, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Um in many ways. But
Yeah. I think that is all there. And when the Donovan, when their interviews, when the CIA, when they're talking about
yeah.
his training, because again this gets into the intersectionality part of the game, where
Yep.
there are a lot of other dynamics. There's class, there are these intra-racial politics and relationships, but then there's the fact that he's this Vietnam vet and he's come back. And when they're talking, and there is a critique available here for like what is the military training people to do, right? That when you've been a killing machine for the state, and that's what you were designed to do, and then you come back and you're supposed to reintegrate, right? So it's all about like reintegration and the failures of reintegration and the failures to handle the mental health, the economic support, etc., of all vets, but particularly of Black vets, during this time, who were, just even more cast aside. You have all of that going on, which is a part of the game's intersectionality, I think. But when you have in the interviews the CIA operatives saying, yeah, Lincoln Clay, tell us about his training. Lincoln Clay was in special forces. And the reason we didn't have to train him to do that. Like, he just was, right? He was just special in terms of his abilities, physical abilities to kill and assassinate. That's like innate, right? So again, it is this sort of dehumanizing perception of Blackness and Black, identity, that you're just already an actual natural killing machine. And when we throw in the other aspects of the taxonomy, like the politics, the ideology, what I would have loved to see in this game, I see that you're sporting the revolutionary look.
I had to.
Yeah.
I had to.
I'm like, I want to unlock that. How do I unlock it? You're sporting the revolutionary look in this moment, but we asked that, to what extent is that all packaging, is that ornamental, right? Like, you do have the voice, you do have Black power being like codified and like symbolized here in this environment, but as Lincoln Clay, who's taken down everybody, collecting money left and right, where's the school lunch program? Where is the other aspects of like a radical Black politics that could really be at the heart of this, not just on the scene, but running through him? Super Negro, be a part of that, right? Like, be a part of, you got the Black Panther look going here, but let's see you participate in that scene. You can't be neutral about it. You can't just be indifferent as a character. So there are certainly ways ideologically where we're getting a lot here to discuss, to investigate, to have as a part of our own player, fantasies in this space. But ideologically, it doesn't go the distance with those things either, right? It definitely, as we're saying about like the Haitians and the coding of the Haitians as the too bad Black, like that's the, if you're gonna have like Blackness at the center of this that we have to embrace as characters, you still got to have Black villains, right? Like, this is a Black villain who's an anti-hero who we can kind of like because of all the things we've said, but you still got to have some Black villains. So that's going to be the Haitians. But at the end of the day, I want to know about its politics. I want about the strength of its politics, the resistant politics that say, okay, I'm gonna take these bosses down, and when I flip this warehouse, instead of just giving it to crime bosses, maybe I will give it to crime bosses, but we're gonna have an after-school lunch program here. We're gonna do that. Like,
but the game doesn't let you do that.
No, the game doesn't let you do that, but let's signal some of the real meaningful parts of what that revolutionary impulse was signifying and was actually doing. And we don't get that. We just get the ornamental, to some extent, aspects of it. We get it indicated, but not realized.
So, and that's interesting, right? Because like when we think about, and I kept this part because it's kind of like why the game is still so buggy. Even though I'm playing a definitive edition, it is that the game was really buggy when it came out.
Your game was buggy, and I didn't pay for the definitive edition. I paid for the cheaper edition, and we both have buggy games still.
Yeah, but mine only is a person stuck in the game, not my game crashing. So but to go back to talking about things like reintegration into society and the like, we have hints, we have moments where this is hinted at, and this is always a big question when we have games that hint at things like this but don't like cover them fully, right? Even at the very beginning of the game, when Lincoln is coming back, there's the white veteran who is outside the bus station, who sits down and says to him, you have to remember that just because you're back doesn't mean you're back. Right. So there is that one line that, unless you know, like how veterans, and especially Black veterans coming back from the Vietnam conflict, struggled with reintegration, right? Because purposely, right, when they were deployed, right, the kind of Vietnam military actively fucked with their brains, right? Because they were fighting the same kind of civil rights. They were fighting for the same kind of like civil rights that Black folks were fighting for in the US. So they were constantly being barraged with, why are you fighting against us when we're fighting the same fight, right? So they were not only having to deal with being deployed and having to kind of murder like other marginalized folks, but having that kind of thrown in their faces constantly, right? That they were actively killing folks that were fighting their same struggle, so that they were kind of a tool of the same, they were kind of a tool of the same government, the same organization that was trying to destroy them, right? So all of that, like on top of everything else for Black soldiers in the Vietnam conflict, you know, caused all kinds of shenanigans. I'm gonna say it that way. I was gonna say something else.
I'm looking at this scene right here where this is where you meet Cassandra after you've been, you know, shot in the head and you've recovered. And this is the second time you meet Cassandra in the game, because the first time she is the crime boss you're actually looking for, but she plays a victim. She pretends she's a victim so she can escape because she's smart like that, right? She's savvy.
Yeah.
And now you finally figured it out, you know, that she was running stuff. And you know, you're about to create an alliance to work together. And I remember, now it's kind of coming back to me that, you know, along these lines about the game's politics, I remember when at some moment Cassandra's like, wants to take it that step further and is like, let's arm everybody. Let's arm the all of the Black neighborhoods. Like, I think, am I remembering that correctly? Like, she's kind of a voice for realizing what radicality really looks like. Radicality is not just like Lincoln Clay, let me kill all the people who killed, you know, my family. You know, that's the revenge quest, which is so common in video games. We've seen it in The Last of Us, The Last of Us 2, for example, especially Ellie's blind faith revenge quest that makes no damn sense at a certain point. And Lincoln here too, where it's this personal, intersubjective, I'm gonna get, you know, I'm gonna exact this violence on these individuals and not the structure. Whereas Cassandra is like, let's take the structure, you know, arm everybody. And that is more along the lines. And now I would argue that you already have a game here that is not going to appease a mainstream ideologically. Getting sales, getting the game to sell and making your money is one thing, which the game did do. But, you know, I think the reason the reception is so mixed is because of its politics. So I would argue you've already lost any center or, you know, majority of players, you know, by what it's already doing. So you have nothing to lose by going deeper, going into a deeper cut ideologically and really showing what a kind of more comprehensive scale of resistance looks like in this context. Yes, you can still be a mafia boss, but if Lincoln were to absorb some of the real fervor of these politics, you know, then I think we do have a very different game, and we probably still have the same outcome in terms of its mass reception, right? In terms of its fan reception of like, it's still offensive, it's still broken. Yes, it is. It's still glitchy, but all these games are broken and glitchy and stuff. But, you know, I mean, it's still gonna not appease that sector of the community no matter what. So tightening up and making its politics more sophisticated, you know, I argue you really have nothing to lose with that at this point.
And it kind of makes sense too, because what we've been talking about and the way that Lincoln has been not only trained by the military, but is changed not only by the military, but by the fact that, you know, he's lived in New Orleans in the US his entire life. And Cassandra is not as far removed from kind of military dictatorships and wanting to overthrow the government in very real ways, right? She doesn't have those buffers of kind of military experience, the buffers of wanting to belong, the buffers of the buffers of trying to assimilate right into this kind of into this mafia culture, right? She's just like, no, fuck the police, let's kill everybody. And again, like I said, I think that that's kind of the real difference between the folks in the holler and the Haitians, that doesn't get explored, right? Is that their connection to radicality and the politics that's going on in Haiti in the 1950s and 1960s and beyond. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and then looking at some of the other things that we noted here, because basically Mafia 3 has like every aspect of the taxonomy, with the exception of two, I think, the modding communities, the mod culture, because there are mods for this game, but they're not mods that kind of intensify like its Black cultural context. And what was the other thing? So it didn't have character creation, because you can't, it's not a character creation system. So really it has everything else. And so if we want to talk about some of these other things, we're probably not going to be able to hit on everything. But I'll ask you, why did you choose this segment of the game leading up to what we're going to experience in Perla's bar / entertainment space?
I think
club. The club.
Yeah, Perla's and we'll talk about what Perla's is too in a minute, but I think I chose this because there's so much in this like 1 hour segment, because this is what it took. I think it took me like hour and 2 minutes to play through this segment, and if I had driven faster it would have taken me less time. But there's so much going on here, just in terms of wanting to be assimilated into mafia culture, only to have the mafia turn on you and murder your entire family, right?
Yeah.
That segment where Lincoln is being nursed back to health, and so we have these other things that are going on in terms of like the news reels that are playing on television, the discussions that are going on in the CIA hearings, and I think Donovan even calls talks about what he's doing and using the resources that he uses, and he says, yeah, I don't want to get caught up in Hoover's ferry brigade. So there's that there are all these mentions of very specific and influential cultural, political moments that just get hinted at, and they mean something if you know what they are, but there's not anything there that connects it to like real history in a way that would make your average player say, oh, I see why Hoover is important in the context of Lincoln Clay, or oh, I see why Papa Doc is important in the context of Lincoln Clay. But if you know history, then it makes perfect sense. And so, and again, that goes back to your point about reception, right? would that make people less receptive, right? Because we always have the loud group of folks on the internet who are like, I don't want politics in my video games. So yeah, I mean, you have that contingent of folks who don't want politics in their video game. Would that have made the game? You already have a game with a Black protagonist, right? And a Black anti-hero, not hero. He's still, doing some stuff that is not the greatest. In terms of being
he's meeting with the voice here who looks like Shaft.
He looks exactly like Shaft, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's the voice on the radio. He looks like Shaft.
Which is pretty cool. And there's like propaganda posters there are propaganda posters on the wall that are also kind of situate them in kind of revolutionary circles, not just Black revolutionary circles, but I think there are Che Guevara posters on the wall as well. So there's lots of not only Black radicalism, but communism, and just kind of radical politics as a whole.
KKK style stuff, like the hillbillies, don't they have their own posters and advertising and
Dixie
stuff?
Mafia.
The Dixies. Yeah.
The Dixie Mafia. Yeah, but I'm talking about in this space. There are posters on that wall behind him.
Behind him. Yeah, there are. It's like a ton of posters in there.
Yeah, I was just kind of saying, I was trying to remember if I captured those.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at this point, what he's doing is he's going to bust up the rackets at Perla's, which is one of Sammy's old clubs. It's not Sammy's, but Sammy had a second club. See, there's some of them on that side, and when we come back, I think I get the ones on the other side. That Sammy named after his wife, Perla, and it was the fancier club, right?
Right. And it's a prostitution ring now, so it is taken over by the Dixie Mafia, which is they have their symbol is the Confederate flag, and they are a bunch of hillbillies who call you the N-word through the whole mission. And you go in there and you have to sort of reclaim this space, but they also drug and enslave mostly Black women. It's all Black women. It's all Black women who are part of their like slave sex trade.
And so they have them all locked up, and they actually called them and this, you get this information from The Voice, they actually called them their thoroughbreds.
The reason I said mostly is because I thought there were white women in there. There might have just been a mixed racial crowd in the space, but the women that they have like detained are Black. Yeah. And so you're going on that mission, and you have no problem killing all the Dixies,
but that's the thing, is you don't have to, right? This could be because the mission is only to free the girls, right? So if you look up in the upper left-hand corner of here, it says free the strung out girls, right? So that's all you have to do. Is to go in there and free them. So go in there and unlock those doors and let them out is what you need to do.
And then you can go back to The Voice and continue the mission. I think eventually you have to kill a pimp later, but you don't have to go slaughter everybody in the bar. I mean, not in this, but I think everybody does that. I think the vast majority of people do that. Now, maybe not if you're playing this game and you're on the side ideologically of the Dixie Mafia, maybe then you don't go and kill them all. But if you have any kind of identification with Lincoln and Black people, I'm pretty sure you kill them all, right? Like I've never seen a playthrough where someone stealth snuck in. You can stealth it all you want because it's to your advantage. That's how you can clear a room full of enemies, is to be stealthy. And we should say mechanically, as far as mechanics and animations relate to Black representation, Lincoln, as the super Negro, as the magic Negro, has some exacting animations for melee combat. Like, he is a brute force. If you have a shotgun or a rifle, he just beats people with that. He cracks their jaw, and it's like a one-hit kill with the weapon, and that is how he takes out a whole room. I don't even shoot most of the time because you don't have much ammo at this point. I have limited resources. It makes a lot of noise, but I think I've never seen anyone play these missions and just not kill all of them. Like they are coded as the bad guys in this particular context, just like the 100% are in the other context. Here, it's like, kill all these Dixie, and they're calling you the N-word repeatedly in the whole mission. So we were talking about Black Rage.
But if you play as Lincoln, you don't care, right? Because I mean, the game starts, and when he's going into the Federal Reserve, your quote unquote friend, Sal Marcano's son, tells you, well, just know that they're probably going to use some pretty rough language. And he's like, I'm used to being called the N-word, right? And he goes, oh, but I might have to kind of follow along with them just for appearance's sake, right? And he's like, I'm okay with that, right? And so
he can play along, but that doesn't mean it doesn't bother him. That doesn't mean
what I'm saying, he's used to it, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
And he even says this. So I think that what is interesting for me is when I started this mission the very first time, right? When I started this mission the very first time, I was like, okay, go in and free the girls. I was like, I can do this. I can go in, I can sneak in, I can free these women, and like complete this mission without having to do too much, right? Because I like, if a mission is meant to be stealthy, I like to try to do the stealthy mission. But I walked in, and we'll see this because we'll see this. I walked in. There's one thing that changed my mind. I walked into Perlis. And if you walk in, you talk to this woman, Sheila, is like over to the left. You'll see a lot of stuff. There's a collectible, there's some other stuff. In this room, as big as day, there is a giant Confederate flag hanging on the wall. And as soon as I saw that Confederate flag, I said, nope, ain't nobody getting out of here alive but the girls.
I have already made up my mind because
I've already made up my mind. And I think it's in one of these rooms right here.
And before you kill the boss, you hear him yelling at his crew, how dare you let that so-and-so, this, that. I mean, he uses the N-word and says, how dare you let him come into here, one, Negro, you let come in here and take everybody out. So he's lecturing them, but he's just repeatedly saying the N-word. And I couldn't find him. I was already frustrated because the building is set up kind of like a maze, and you've got to go through these rooms, and there's, debris and boxes and things in your way, blocking you from like a clear path to him. So you have to scramble all around trying to figure him out. So I'm already frustrated as a player by the time I get there, and I've killed everybody, but it's just a matter of finding him. And I hear him saying all this about me, and I'm like, wait until I get in that room. You wait until I get in that room. And yeah, I think it plays on. So what I think we're talking about is the slippage between the character, because Lincoln and how he might want to handle this. But I do agree. He says his quest is going to be to make sure he's going to kill everybody anyway. Like, that's what he says his motive is to take everything, claim everything, take over. So I believe that it wouldn't necessarily be that much slippage, but potential slippage between the character and the player and our motivations, depending on who you are and how all of this sits with you, right? The human trafficking element, Black women as as exploited victims here in this case, and that gets me every time. That got me again, and I just want to go after this mission and go sit down and have a drink with Cassandra, talk about this, because she's the only boss that you have met at this point in the game. And you have to assign this to her, that she's going to take over this. And I'm like, are you going to run a different style? Presumably you're going to run a different style of the sex industry here. Your input in this scene, it should be different, right? It shouldn't. But I want to make sure. I want to have that conversation, have a drink, and say, listen. Sex work is one thing that's got its place historically, culturally, socially, etc. I don't necessarily want to exclude that from the economy or from what's happening, but what is your approach going to be? How are the women going to be protected and treated and have agency and have their say? I want to have an extended conversation, about her business model and how the workers will be treated in this new environment. Or am I just going to replace a version of what already existed, but there's no Dixie Mafia this time running it, so you don't have that option. But again, it's like the deeper cuts here critically, like Cassandra, because I'm giving Cassandra everything anyway. As I said, all the time, whenever I play this game, she gets every district. She gets every district she's not supposed to get. I'm like, downtown is yours. This is yours. All the
But the
districts.
game won't let you do that.
This
You
is an
can't.
Irish community. You're limited, but when you recruit the other bosses, I think the first one you have to give to them. But after that, you can disproportionately give things to Cassandra, because that's what I've done.
Mm-hmm. But the game
punishes you for that decision.
Yeah, it becomes more difficult, if not impossible.
It becomes unbeatable.
Yeah,
it becomes unbeatable.
Because then you have to fight everybody all the time except her. Yeah. Right. And to think about that just mechanically, right? So that's one of the game mechanics that also it restricts kind of a fully realized Black empire. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like that can't happen, right?
It's structurally, computationally stacks the deck against you. But you know what? They're gonna tell our audience, our viewers here on the Black Games Archive. You know what? I'm gonna make a promise. I'm gonna make a promise to you, Sam, to anyone watching this, circa 10 years down the road. If you've watched this, just know I commit to finishing Mafia 3 by giving everything to Cassandra and surviving it, surviving the structural limitations, that want to preclude that type of decision making. I'm going to finish it, because last time I didn't finish it. It got really hard. Everyone was turned against me, and I'd already put in I have a certain amount of hours I can play each game before I tap out and have to move on, whatever that number is, 50 hours, 60, whatever. I'd already put in that quality time, and I said, you know what, I've gotten the Mafia 3 experience. I don't need to finish the final missions, because it was so hard. So this time around, now that I've bought the $10 version of this game, I'm gonna push. I'm gonna press on and continue to make that decision and see what happens. But yeah, that's one of the mechanical, rules. This is in the rule set, that you shall not play this way. Mm-hmm. It's like in Grand Theft Auto 5, where Franklin can never be as wealthy as Michael and Trevor, and mm-hmm. he's the Black character, and even when you rig the stock market in your favor, basically you got all this insider information, and you can't really use it to help Franklin as much as you could use it to help the other guys, and that mm-hmm. always upset me. But that is a structural bias, right? That the game is not critical of having, but has nonetheless.
So and I agree with those things, but I want to point out something, is that the woman we just freed said, she said something because you walk in and you shoot this guy, and she goes, you killed him. And she was like, good, kill them all. But and so to talk about like the treatment of the women and how Cassandra will deal with sex work differently, wanting to have those discussions like in the game, but the game, of course, not allowing that kind of thing. If you look at like all of these notes that are laying around either mm-hmm. in the girls' rooms, or like in like their staging areas, their makeup areas, etc. Some of these locks got stuck and I had to open them like twice. But there are all of these notes that are meant to be inspirational to other girls, like just keep your head about you, just keep going, we'll make it home one day we'll get home again, all of these other things, so that they are so it's clear, right, that they are being held against their will, and they are all, especially if this last girl we just saw, of course, all very much under the influence, right?
They have all these drugs next to them, because they
have all these drugs next to them, right? Their doors are locked from the outside. Mm-hmm. That's why we have to break the doors. Like, that's why we have to open the doors from the outside and so on. So yeah, they're being held. And so it's not just the sexual servitude, because Cassandra talks about this when earlier when Lincoln goes to meet her and figures out that she really is the Haitian crime boss he's been looking for, and it mm-hmm. wasn't the dude that he murdered. Right.
And she went along with it. She was like, "Kill him! He's the one. That horrible guy locked me in a
he
cabinet.
locked me up in there. He did
Right.
horrible things to me.
I
Yeah.
I really just want to play this game as Cassandra. Like, can we get a Mafia 4 and play as Cassandra, please? That's all I really need from this franchise.
So, but yeah, it's pretty interesting though, because she actually talks about the other things that the Dixie Mafia is doing, like the guy that you actively gotta go to kill, like in a later mission. I think his name is Merle.
Yeah.
She talks about the fact that he takes Black folks like out to the swamps and doesn't feed them for several days and then releases them and has these kind of slaveholders slash escaped slave escaped enslaved person fantasy hunts.
Yeah, like a fugitive slave
Exactly.
hunts,
And
killing the fugitive.
exactly. And she said specifically that's what happened to her sister.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So we have all of these different kinds of race-based atrocities. What I find interesting is that what we see with these races, here's another giant Confederate flag,
Right.
is that with these race-based atrocities is that they're all mapped on the bodies of Black women.
Yes. And here, Sam, I mean, you can see in the corner, your objective is to go talk to Donovan. Like, you're done, unless you want to do some more.
Everybody's not dead. I'm not done.
And I love that as a feature, right? As a sort of mechanical and narrative feature to tell you that you've already met the objective here. But like I said, most people do not see it as that. But you're monetarily encouraged to keep going because you still have damage you have money to recoup, right? So the financial structures, the capitalist logic is on your side, saying you really want to keep going and like killing people and finding money and stuff and shaking this whole place down because you're incentivized to do it. You're incentivized to slaughter the racists. You're financially incentivized to do it. And so I think that it would probably very, very rare that you wouldn't do it. You're gonna walk away with money on the table and with this guy still alive. I don't think you get to kill Meryl in this moment.
No.
It's later.
Yeah.
But you're still gonna wreak some havoc in here and before you call it a day on this part of the mission.
Yeah. No, I was quite literally going through to make sure I had murdered everybody.
Yeah.
because again, we're talking about sexual servitude, we're talking about forced addiction, we're talking about basically enslavement, right? You can't let that stand.
Against Black women, you can't let it stand. And so I will say this: when you flip this environment and you turn it over to Cassandra, she doesn't have women locked behind doors, because even though we didn't have that conversation, I went back to this club for, I don't remember if you had to come back or why I was back, but I'm walking around and it looks better. It's better lit and people are seemingly having a good time, and it's still a place for sex work to take place. It's still a part of the prostitution ring. But when you go upstairs, the rooms are empty, because I went back upstairs. You could still unlock doors and the doors are locked, but there's no one in them. So she's not re-enslaving Black women to be a part of this. So there's that. Even though we didn't have an in-depth conversation about, who's gonna share in the profits of this space besides her and me, how do the workers profit and benefit from their own labor? We didn't have that. We didn't get to have that conversation. But at least there's an indication that the space is different because it looks different. And, like I said, there's no women behind locked doors.
Yeah. And
a nice little Easter egg is one of the women in the lobby at the counter is someone you meet when you're serving in a soup kitchen. I think when you're serving in a soup kitchen early on, one of the kind of getting to know the game moments, and you have this young woman come up to you who you're having a friendly conversation with, her, and she's also working in that space. So this is like a person that you like and presumably trust. So it's a completely different environment in terms of who's there socially, like the Black social scene of the area, is now kind of reinvigorated by reclaiming this like social space, this key social space.
And if I just running through some of these buildings that are like empty and boarded up, as you reclaim these spaces, and they become, and it's interesting, as you reclaim these spaces and they become kind of your spaces, Black spaces again, some of the area around these buildings starts to come up again. So these stores reopen, the stores reopen and the like. So I think it's really just kind of interesting the ways that we see, again, Lincoln as an anti-hero, because, at the same time, he's supposed to be one of the quote unquote bad guys because he's still, he's still a criminal, right? But he is reclaiming these spaces from the bigger bad, shall we say. But then the bigger bad,
it's still a localized bigger bad, right? Like again, we've talked about the limits of its like systemic and systemic sort of interventions, and you can't get around the fact that you're working with a CIA operative, which brings the CIA and their positionality into all kinds of like Black movements and key sort of Black actors, right? And usually working from a position of sabotage, right? That this is a fantasy that this will be your buddy, that they will have saved you, and so that they could use you in a certain way to flip this area, to take away the Saul's power, basically, right? That they want to use you in this way. But again, this is the limits of your agency. These are the limits of Black agency in this context.
As Blackness as a tool, right? You don't get to be the powerful one. You get to be a tool of the powerful one. And I think that that's just that constant, like that constant reference back to his relationship with Donovan, and it, like you called it a buddy film, but at the same time, when you watch the way Donovan talks about him in these congressional hearings or in these Hoover hearings, he doesn't feel like a friend.
Well, there's not always an equal playing field, right? So when the buddy film tradition, they called the biracial buddy films, Diawara, film scholar, kind of coined that phrase, and he was talking a lot about like of the 80s, but biracial buddy films. But this is predates. I mean, Sidney Poitier is sort of an actor who played characters who had these white buddies, so like a film like The Defiant Ones, for example, In the Heat of the Night, I would characterize as a buddy film. And those dudes were not his buddy, right? Like he is the Black character who's this integrationist type figure, the exceptional Negro. That's what Sidney Poitier's characters were most often. And there's no level playing field. There's a power imbalance in those relationships. Often Sidney Poitier's characters were way better, way more interesting, way more competent, to be exceptional than his white counterparts. But that relationship existed to try to make him appealing to white audiences. And so there was never a level playing field. And even there are times when the white buddy turned against him. Like there's a classic moment in The Defiant Ones where Tony Curtis plays his buddy and he's white, and they are being chased by this mob because they're ex-cons on the run. Let me tell the story real quickly. But anyway, he puts on blackface. He puts on mud, his face to camouflage himself, and then the lynch mob catches up with them. And they're like, we got them. They're looking at, we got these two Negroes, and we got them. They were on the run, and they were like, let's lynch them. I mean, this is vigilante justice. They're trying to figure out what to do with them. And the townspeople are like, let's lynch them. And Tony Curtis turns on his friend, his buddy, Sidney Poitier's character, Noah Cullen, and he says, why, you can't lynch me. I'm a white man. And the look that Sidney Poitier gives him, right, is like, you turned a what? You turning on me after all of this, right? Like Tony Curtis, well, that's the limits of our friendship, right? That I am going to call on my, my privilege as a white man to distance myself from you. And that's how I read those segments where Donovan is basically spilling the beans and, showing that he was never a friend of Lincoln Clay. He was using him, and that's also in that tradition of film.
Yeah, because he had to have some kind of amnesty, right? Because he tells everything. Because they come in there and they're like, "So you helped Lincoln Clay kill all these people?" And he was like, "I absolutely did."
Yep, he was a killing machine. He was good at it. So yeah, anyway, we could go on and on and on for hours and hours about this game, but it seemed like an important game to begin with in the archive as far as creating this type of content, and kind of reinvigorating discussions about it and playthroughs of it. And as we said, it basically, all the descriptors of the taxonomy are relevant here, except for character customization and the modding community, where we haven't seen any significant mods for the game in that way. But everything else applies, and including its anti-Black ideologies, that are also at the surface, deep into the tissues, and even mechanically, driven in the game. So we hope that that folks will find this discussion useful as a launch pad for reinvestigating Mafia 3.